I always enjoy about Pentecost. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of exuberance, a lot of red probably in church, and this year a lot of John, which is a joy to all our hearts. And it's Mary Jo, Anne, Judy, all from Otago, a bit of a local convention this time for us, and Anne with some background on yet another difficult passage from
Yes,
John.
so we have been dipping in and out of this final discourse of Jesus's on and off, it seems like for months. It's probably not for months, probably just for weeks. So you will all remember abidings and commands to love, and it really has been jumping around. And another theme which is actually woven all the way through the discourse, but we haven't really focused on yet, is that of what Jesus calls the Paraclete, in Greek, the Holy Spirit. And of course, we're focusing on it this week because it is Pentecost. Jesus brings the Paraclete forward 5 times during the discourse. And in the little bits of reading that we have for this week, we have the third, fourth, and fifth of these kind of presentations, I guess, or promises of the Holy Spirit. Some English translations actually just use the word paraclete, which is unusual, but it's because it's just such a hard word to translate. And what people would normally do is say, well, then let's go and see how it's used in the Old Testament. But of course, the New Testament's in Greek. So if you're going to go and see how it's used in the Old Testament, you really have to go to the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And there's 3 times it's used there that I want to mention as a background. One is in the book of Job, chapter 16 and chapter 33. And there, the paraclete is someone who is speaking in defense of the accused. So that's we often interpret as advocate. And then in the first little snippet we have in today's reading, John 15, 26 to 27, this is in the context of some pretty dire warnings of how much the world is going to hate the disciples. And so here the paraclete comes as someone speaking for them, an advocate speaking for them against all the hatred of the world. Then going further back in the Hebrew scriptures, Greek version of them, in Genesis, the paraclete is the one who is the interpreter between Joseph and his brothers. So here, translating, making sense, in some ways, uncovering the truth. And I think you can take that sort of story to John 16, the first appearance of the paraclete there, because there Jesus is probably referring back to the story of the blind man in chapter 9, who was driven out of the synagogue when he's warning the disciples, this is going to happen to you as well. And in this context, the Spirit comes as one who uncovers the truth, reveals that the disciples are actually right, even if they're being thrown out of the synagogue, in the same way that the blind man really was right to seek Jesus. And then the third one in the Old Testament, made famous by the Messiah musical, oratorio, comfort, comfort my people. And then in 16 verses 12 to 15, this fifth promise, here the Paraclete is coming as a comforter, because Jesus is feeling for the confusion and the lostness of the disciples around him, and offers the Holy Spirit to come in this context as a comforter. So it's complex, but just this amazing depiction of this Holy Spirit who we celebrate today.
Thank you, Anne. One of the things I get immediately, I'm reminded of J.B. Phillips' famous words, your God is too small. Clearly, the Paraclete is not going to fit into our little criteria. The second thing I'm reminded of is one of my earliest sermons from many decades ago when I talked about the Spirit as comforter and the American word pacifier. I don't think that'll come up again, but it's useful, I think. I maintain that. Judy, tell me what you find challenging.
I guess I'm challenged just the way the disciples were challenged, because you have periods in your life where you get lost and you get confused and you get frightened or you get lazy or you get whatever it is that takes you away from a feeling of closeness with God. And here is an example of the disciples where they're going to be coming into this terrible time where they lose Jesus, and he's always been there for them. And that he's always been able to answer their questions. He's been able to heal them. He's been able to guide them, and he's not going to be there in person anymore. But he's assuring them he has to die, and he has to die because the Holy Spirit cannot come while he is there in person. It is a challenge to get oneself out of the doldrums or the lostness or whatever and come back. And that's what Jesus is promising us. We will have somebody who will bring us back, show us the truth.
That sense of, here's the sorrow beginning to accumulate, and Jesus cuts across and says, but it's got to happen and it will be all right, which is what I'm hearing you say. So,
Yes.
All right, well, let's Mary Jo, talk to me about challenge from your perspective.
Well, the words of Jesus saying that you're going to have a hard time and you're going to be hated, but that's, not what I personally want to hear. That's not music to our ears. I've just recently lost my mum in February, and that sense of when someone dies, they are so gone. Of course, it was different because Jesus says, yes, I'll be gone physically, but good news, my spirit will be with you. So I think that's totally the difference between losing someone we love. They are really gone from this world, but the disciples were able to have that comfort of saying, well, I'm gone physically, but I'm going to be with you and in you, which is like, wow. Yeah, that's
the in you is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult stuff to grasp. That's challenging. And that sense of wanting to hold on to somebody physically, I really get that. And the disciples must have felt that. Well, they did, obviously, the grief and but you've always been with us. You've been constant. You've been there. This is a whole new, challenging, sort of scary experience. But
and interesting, I think you've hit a nail on the head there, because of course you get the scene after the resurrection where Jesus says, don't hold on to me. Yes. And you picked up those same words there. And I think that's very important. But we'll flick past to Anne, and what do you find challenging?
Well, I find John's Gospel always challenging. And part of the challenge for me is just letting my brain go into kind of free spin and let all the words flow over, because there's so many words and they become so convoluted. So the challenge is to stop and to dig deep, because so many of the things which, when they just flow over you, don't really seem to make a huge amount of sense, do make sense when you start digging, but will only make sense if you start digging. So in preparing the background to this, I could have spoken for 3 hours just on the background of this passage, and you would have only begun to scratch the surface. So I think for me, the challenge is always, don't just let the words that you don't understand flow over your head. Actually dig down deeper. Now, I've heard the Gospels beautifully described in the phrase that we use for a sacrament. In the Anglican Church, we talk about a sacrament being an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual truth. And I heard someone say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the outward and visible sign of Jesus's life. John is the inward and spiritual truth. Yeah. And that's harder to dig down to. But it's
I love that. And John, this kind of interior understanding of Jesus' mind. Let's ask then, these funny times we live in, where are we going to find good news here, Mary Jo?
The good news is what Anne said earlier, that the Paraclete is for us. He is on our side. He's speaking for us. He's comforting us. Yeah, that's such good news. During lockdown, there were lots of those blessing songs that came, and the Aotearoa one, particularly, of course, was very, very beautiful. And at times when I was feeling very scared and uncertain, like, all of us were, to hear that being told to us again, he is for you, he is for you. I just found that so comforting. And so to me, that's the good news.
Love that, Mary Jo. Thank you. And let's see if you can expand on that or take your own angle.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all going to likely to focus in on the presence of the Spirit with us as the good news. I think for me, what is so amazing about it, in 1 John, the Paraclete is also referred to, but there it's Jesus. And so I know it's a very kind of Trinitarian, mixed up sort of thing, but when we're thinking of the Spirit with us, we're actually also thinking of Jesus
Mm.
with us. And I love that, because, you know, sometimes we can think of the Spirit as not really easily distinguished from emotions or from, you know, things that have no substance. When we talk about spiritual as opposed to material, we tend to think that the spiritual stuff's a bit wafty. But here we're actually talking about Jesus. Jesus' Spirit, but Jesus present with us, in us. The Celtic idea of the blessing of, you know, Christ above me, Christ below me, Christ beside me, Christ within me. It's all Christ, and so real, so person.
It's lovely that the Celts have got that for us so clearly, and it really is helpful, almost a tangible sense of the Christ present. Thank you. And Judy, good news from you.
Well, the good news is that it's not just in your head. Jesus is in your heart. And from the heart, we're given the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the wonderful gifts, you know, in Galatians, those lists of things that you so want, and they're given to us. And it's not something that just as we know in our heads, but that come to our hearts and dwell there. The patience, the understanding, the joy, the kindness, the self-control, all of those wonderful gifts. The good news is that they're implanted in us and given to us. So that's the good news.
Thank you, Judy. Yes, the sense of the power of that Spirit that gives us all those gifts, brings us all those gifts to use in the service of the gospel. So let's go, Mary Jo, again and ask you about, so what?
Well, the Spirit is something we can rely on, that creates experiences that is within us and around us and above us, like the Celts said. It makes all the difference, because presence of Jesus can be with us anywhere and everywhere. We can't do things by ourselves. It's the Spirit that convicts us of sin, and it's the Spirit that also works in other people. It's really essential.
And I love that sense of anywhere and everywhere. That's really important. That's Jesus released, as you said earlier, through space and time. Judy, for you, so what?
The Holy Spirit was there right at the beginning, hovering over the waters of creation. And we have the Spirit at Jesus' baptism and at our baptism. And so the Spirit is there at the beginning and will be there at our end. So I love that thing at the end of Jude, you know, the Spirit of Jesus will be able to make us stand upright and present us with exceeding joy. I go back to that a lot. I think, you know, that's the so what. The so what is a Spirit that can present us to God with exceeding joy.
A beautiful reference, Judy.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of the many times that I've sat with people who are dying, and that deep sense of the Spirit lifting them up beyond our sight. Anne, a final word?
Well, I was thinking of this passage being a perfect example of the Spirit in John 3 blowing where she will. The Paraclete is so many things, you know, essentially all that we need. So I think the challenge is, can we keep up with the Spirit who blows where she will and is in each situation as she's needed to be? So can we, as the people of God, be that flexible, be that willing to change to meet the changing needs of the people we're dealing with? I think that's a challenge, but I think it's also a so what. And this is, if we're going to keep up with the Spirit, we can't just sit in our laurels.
Thanks, Anne. And just a hint there of that wonderful theme that you picked up there of the Spirit as the enemy of apathy, who is with us in the present, into the future, bringing all that Jesus is and will be. Anne, Judy, Mary, thanks for just experimenting around this incomprehensible sense of the Spirit with us at Pentecost.